My 7-year-old grandson was swinging his sneakers under the diner booth, licking chocolate ice cream off a plastic spoon, when he asked me the question that ended one version of my life and started another. "Grandpa, why does Dad say you're not real family?" I set my coffee down so carefully that it didn't even rattle the saucer. Outside the window, the late afternoon light was turning the parking lot gold, and for a second I thought I had misheard him. I hadn't. "Not real family," I repeated. "Who told you that, Milo?" He shrugged the way 7-year-olds shrug when they've said something enormous without knowing it. "Dad. He told Mom last week you're not really part of our family anymore." He said it real quiet, but I heard it through the vent in my room. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I had spent 41 years as a structural inspector, the man cities hired to walk into buildings after the architects and contractors had gone home, and tell them the truth about what was actually holding the roof up. I had learned, across 4 decades of climbing into crawl spaces and reading stress fractures like sentences, that the things people are most afraid to look at are usually the things about to come down on their heads. Sitting in that booth across from my grandson, I felt the first hairline crack in something I had trusted my whole life to be solid. I did not know yet how far the damage went. I only knew, the way I always knew standing in a condemned building, that something was very wrong above my head. Thank you for being here with me tonight. If this story finds you somewhere quiet, drop the name of your city or your country in the comments below. I read every single one, and it means more than you know to picture faces behind the words. I do want to say, before we go further, that certain names, places, and small details in this account have been changed or adjusted for storytelling and to protect the people still living through the real consequences of what I'm about to tell you. The lessons in it, though, those are exactly as real as they get. My name is Edwin Marsh. I am 68 years old. For most of my life I lived in a 2-story farmhouse-style home on Larkspur Lane in a small town called Cedar Hollow, with a woman named Rosalind, who I married in 1981 and buried 3 years ago this coming October. Rosalind was the kind of person who noticed things before anyone else in the room did, a loose thread on a coat, a lie in a smile, a load-bearing wall that had been quietly failing for a decade behind fresh paint. I used to joke that between the two of us, she did the actual inspecting and I just carried the clipboard. We had one daughter, Denise, born in 1988, and Denise gave us, 8 years ago, a grandson we both loved with an intensity that surprised us, Milo, a serious, watchful little boy who asked questions the way other children asked for candy, constantly, and without any sense that some questions might be dangerous to ask out loud. 4 years ago, 2 years after we lost Rosalind to a fast and cruel cancer, Denise remarried. Her new husband was a man named Victor Coulter, 44 years old at the time, a financial consultant who ran his own small advisory practice out of an office suite above a bank in the next town over. Victor was smooth in the specific way that certain men are smooth, a good handshake, a good tailor, a way of remembering the names of your grandchildren's teachers that felt, at first, like kindness, and only later revealed itself as something closer to reconnaissance. I want to be honest with you. I liked Victor well enough at the wedding. I liked him well enough at Thanksgiving the following year. It was only slowly, the way water finds a crack in a foundation and takes years to show itself as a stain on the ceiling, that I began to feel something was not right in that house. That Tuesday afternoon at the diner, 3 weeks after Rosalind's birthday, which I still marked every year whether anyone joined me or not, I had picked Milo up from his after-school program because Denise had a late meeting and Victor, according to Denise's text, was traveling for a client. It was supposed to be a simple errand. Ice cream, a little conversation, drop him home by 6. Instead I drove home that evening with my hand so tight on the wheel that my knuckles ached, turning one sentence over and over in my mind. You're not really part of our family anymore. Before I tell you what I found when I went looking for the truth behind that sentence, I want to walk you back a little further, because none of what follows makes sense unless you understand what our family looked like before the cracks started to show. Rosalind and I built the house on Larkspur Lane in 1985, back when the lot was still mostly scrub pine and the road wasn't paved past the mailbox. I did the structural drawings myself, moonlighting off my day job, and Rosalind picked every window because she said a house needed to let in enough light to argue honestly with itself. We raised Denise there. We hosted every Thanksgiving there for 30 years. When Rosalind got sick, we turned the downstairs den into a bedroom so she wouldn't have to manage the stairs, and I spent the last 11 months of her life sleeping in a recliner 4 feet from her bed so that if she woke at 3 in the morning frightened, she wouldn't wake alone. After she died, the house felt like a building I had personally certified as sound, but that no longer had anyone living inside its walls to prove it. Denise worried about me constantly those first months. She called every day. She brought Milo over on weekends so the house would have some noise in it again. And when she told me, 1.5 years after the funeral, that she'd started seeing someone, I told her the only thing a father can honestly tell a grieving daughter starting over, that I wanted her to be happy, and that I trusted her judgment. I still believe I was right to say that. I was simply wrong, for a long time, about the man she'd chosen. Victor Coulter had a gift for making himself indispensable in small, generous-seeming increments. He helped me set up online banking after Rosalind died, patiently, over 2 Sunday afternoons, because I'd never had to manage the household finances alone before. He noticed, correctly, that I was overpaying for homeowners insurance, and got me a better rate. He offered, about 1 year into the marriage, to just take a look at my retirement accounts, since that was his professional specialty, and I remember feeling grateful. My daughter had married a man who was going to make sure her old man didn't get taken advantage of in his later years. What I did not understand, sitting in that diner booth with my grandson's chocolate-smudged question hanging in the air between us, was that the man protecting me from being taken advantage of was the one taking advantage. If you're the kind of person who's been through something like this yourself, I want you to know right now, at the start, that you are not foolish for having trusted someone. The people who do this kind of harm are professionals at being trusted. That is the entire mechanism. Keep that in mind as we go, because I certainly had to keep reminding myself of it. I dropped Milo home at 5:52 that evening. Denise met us at the door in her work clothes, looking tired in the particular way young mothers look tired, and thanked me for the pickup with a hug that lasted half a second longer than usual, like she was hanging onto something. I almost asked her right there on the porch what Victor had meant by what Milo overheard. I almost did. Instead I said nothing, because some instinct, maybe the same instinct that used to stop me at the threshold of a building whose permits didn't quite match its blueprints, told me that walking in and demanding an answer would only get the walls repainted before I could see what was underneath them. I kissed Milo goodnight, told Denise I loved her, and drove home in the dark with the radio off, the way I used to drive home from a bad inspection, running numbers in my head that didn't add up yet. 2 nights after that diner conversation, before I'd said a word about it to anyone, my next-door neighbor, a widow named Grace Patrone who had lived beside Rosalind and me since 1990, stopped me at my own mailbox with a look on her face I hadn't seen since the week Rosalind was diagnosed. "Edwin," she said, glancing back toward her own porch as if checking she hadn't been followed. "I don't want to speak out of turn, but I've been meaning to say something for weeks and I keep losing my nerve. Your son-in-law's car has been in your driveway some very strange hours. 2, 3 in the morning, some nights, when Denise and the boy weren't with him. I see the porch light go on, then off, then on again, like someone pacing." I told her, honestly, that I hadn't noticed, because on those nights I had almost certainly been asleep, deeper and heavier than any sleep I'd known in years, a fact that, at the time, I still credited to grief and age rather than to anything being done to me. "There's something else," Grace said, lowering her voice further. 2 weeks ago, I saw him carrying a small case out to his car around 1 in the morning. Looked medical. A soft-sided cooler bag, the kind you'd keep insulin in. I told myself it was none of my business. But then I thought of you in there alone, and I thought, well, I thought somebody ought to say something, even if it turns out to be nothing. I thanked her, the same tired, automatic thanks I'd been offering everyone for months, and walked back inside feeling the floor tilt slightly beneath me in a way that had nothing to do with balance. It was Grace Patron's small case in the middle of the night, more than anything else, that made me finally sit down at my kitchen table that evening with a legal pad, because a man does not carry a medical cooler out of a sleeping house at 1 in the morning unless he has something in it he does not want anyone to see delivered in daylight. I did not sleep much that night. Around 11, I got up, made tea I didn't drink, and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad, the way I had for 41 years whenever a building's problems needed to be written down before they could be understood. I wrote down every small strange thing from the past 8 months that I had noticed and dismissed. In March, Victor had asked, over dinner, in a tone so casual I almost missed it, whether Rosalind and I had ever set up anything formal for Milo's education, a trust, a 529, anything like that. I told him yes, that Rosalind, in the last year of her life, had put together a modest education trust for Milo through our family attorney, funded by a small life insurance policy she'd kept current since Denise was a baby. Victor had nodded, said that was wonderful foresight, and never mentioned it again. At the time I thought nothing of it. Fathers-in-law get asked about money. It's normal. In June, my primary doctor, a kind, overworked man named Dr. Abasi, had run a routine panel and mentioned, almost in passing, that my cholesterol numbers looked slightly off from my last visit, nothing alarming, probably diet. I remembered that Victor had started bringing over a heart-healthy casserole every Sunday around that same time, insisting I eat a full plate before he'd let Denise take Milo home. I had thought it was thoughtful. A son-in-law feeding his lonely father-in-law. I wrote it down anyway. In August, I had gone looking in my own filing cabinet for the original deed to the lake cabin Rosalind and I had bought in 1996, a small 2-bedroom place on Cobalt Lake that Denise had grown up spending every July at, and found the folder slightly out of order, not ransacked, just subtly rearranged, the way a folder looks when someone has gone through it carefully and put it back almost exactly right. I remembered thinking, at the time, that I was simply getting older and more forgetful about where I'd left things. Sitting at that kitchen table at midnight with the legal pad in front of me, I no longer believed I was forgetful. I believed, the way I used to believe standing under a ceiling that groaned in a way ceilings shouldn't groan, that someone had been quietly testing the load I could bear before deciding how much weight to finally put on me. The next morning, I called the one person I still trusted enough to say all of this out loud to before I was certain of anything, my old friend Ruth Alvarado. Ruth and I had known each other since 1994, when I inspected a warehouse fire scene for an insurance claim and she was the detective assigned to rule out arson. We'd stayed friendly across 3 decades. She'd retired from the county sheriff's department 2 years earlier and now did private consulting work, mostly background checks and fraud investigations for small firms and the occasional worried family member. Ruth was 61, sharp-eyed, built like someone who'd spent 30 years convincing bigger men to sit down and answer her questions, and she did not waste words. "Edwin," she said when she picked up. "It's been a while. Everything all right?" "I don't know yet," I said. "That's actually why I'm calling." I told her everything. The comment Milo overheard. The casseroles. The cholesterol numbers. The rearranged folder. The trust fund question in March that had never come up again. Ruth listened without interrupting, the way she always had, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Edwin, I want you to hear something clearly," she said finally. None of what you just told me is proof of anything on its own. A concerned son-in-law asking about a trust fund is normal. A man bringing his father-in-law dinner is normal. But you've spent your whole career reading small signs of big problems before anyone else could see them. I trust that instinct. So let's find out, quietly, whether you're looking at a coincidence or a foundation crack. What do I do first? I asked. First, Ruth said, you do nothing that tips them off. If there's something happening here, the worst thing you can do is confront it before you understand its shape. Keep being exactly the father-in-law you've always been. And second, get me copies of anything financial you can lay your hands on without anyone knowing. Statements, that trust paperwork, anything with Victor's name near your money. I'll start there. I want to pause here and tell you something, because I know some of you listening have felt this exact tension. There is a specific, lonely kind of dread that comes from suspecting the people closest to you while still having to sit across the dinner table from them and pass the mashed potatoes like everything is fine. I did that for the better part of 3 weeks. I want you to know it is possible to survive that kind of performance without losing your mind, but I will not pretend it is easy. 2 Sundays after my call with Ruth, Victor came by the house alone. Denise had taken Milo to a birthday party, carrying, as he often did, a folder of what he called just some paperwork to keep things tidy for your files. He'd started doing this about 6 months earlier, dropping off copies of statements, insurance summaries, updates on accounts he said he was helping me monitor since my minor stroke scare the previous winter, a scare that had, in fact, turned out to be a bad inner infection that only briefly mimicked stroke symptoms, but which Victor had seized on immediately as a reason I shouldn't have to deal with all this paperwork alone anymore. That Sunday, while he made coffee in my kitchen with the easy familiarity of a man who'd made himself at home there 100 times, I did something I am not proud of and do not regret. I opened his leather portfolio bag, which he'd left on the hall table while he searched my cabinets for the good mugs, and photographed every page inside it with my phone before he came back into the room. Most of it was exactly what he said it was. But near the bottom of the stack was a document I did not recognize, a form titled Petition for Appointment of Guardian, with my name typed in the box marked Proposed Ward, and beneath it, a section headed Basis for Incapacity, with several lines already filled in describing progressive cognitive decline, confusion regarding financial matters, and recent unexplained memory lapses consistent with early dementia. The form was dated 2 weeks earlier. It had not been filed with any court yet, there was no stamp, no case number, but it had already been drafted, in full, ready to be filed, with a second attached document listing Victor Coulter as the proposed guardian of my person and estate. I stood in my own front hallway holding my phone with a photograph of a document that would, if filed and granted, legally declare me incompetent and hand control of everything I own to my son-in-law, and I understood, all at once and with total clarity, exactly what Milo had overheard through that vent. If Victor was planning to have me declared incompetent, the last thing he needed was a sharp 7-year-old asking his grandfather questions about anything he'd seen or heard in that house. Telling Milo I wasn't real family anymore wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was containment. It was a man sealing off a witness before the demolition began. I closed the portfolio, put it back exactly as I'd found it, and when Victor came back into the hallway with 2 mugs of coffee, I smiled and thanked him for stopping by. If you're still with me at this point in the story, type the word foundation in the comments below, because that's exactly what I felt slipping out from under me that afternoon, and I want to know who's still standing on solid ground with me before I tell you what came next. I also want to remind you gently that some details ahead have been reconstructed and adjusted for privacy, though the pattern of what happened is drawn from things that happen to real families every single day. I called Ruth that same night from my truck, parked 3 streets away from my own house, because some part of me no longer trusted my own kitchen to be private. A guardianship petition, she repeated, once I'd read her the document word for word. Edwin, listen to me carefully. In this state, a petition like that requires supporting evidence, typically a physician's evaluation or affidavit attesting to incapacity. Has any doctor examined you recently and told you anything close to what's written on that form?
No, I said.
Dr. Abbasi ran blood work in June and told me I was, in his words, annoyingly healthy for a man your age. Then whoever's building this case needs a doctor willing to sign off on something that isn't true, Ruth said. That's a felony waiting to happen, not just a family dispute. I need you to think hard. Has Victor introduced you to any new doctor, any new financial advisor, anyone at all in the last 6 months who seemed to appear out of nowhere? I thought about it, and the answer came to me almost immediately, the way an obvious crack in a wall becomes visible only once someone points a flashlight at the right angle. For months earlier, Victor had recommended I switch my primary care to a concierge physician he knew personally, a Dr. Preston Halloway, who according to Victor specialized in geriatric wellness and could give me more attentive, unhurried care than my overworked family doctor. I had gone to 2 appointments with Dr. Halloway. Both times, the doctor had spent an unusual amount of time asking me questions that felt, in retrospect, less like medical history and more like a memory test disguised as small talk, what day of the week it was, what I'd had for breakfast, whether I could name the current governor. There's a Dr. Halloway, I told Ruth. Victor set it up. I saw him twice. I'll run him, Ruth said. Edwin, I need you to do something for me starting tomorrow, and I need you to trust me on this even though it's going to feel strange. I want you to keep a written log, with times, of everything you eat and drink that Victor personally brings you or prepares for you. Every casserole, every coffee, every glass of water he hands you directly. Can you do that? The question landed in my chest like a dropped stone. You think he's giving me something? I think, Ruth said carefully, that a guardianship petition built on claims of confusion and memory loss is a lot easier to win in front of a judge if the person in question actually seems confused and forgetful when a doctor examines them. I hope I'm wrong. But I've seen this pattern before, Edwin, more than once, and I'd rather you keep a log for nothing than not keep one and regret it. I kept the log starting the very next morning. For the next 2.5 weeks, I wrote down every meal, every drink, every pill bottle Victor helped me organize into a weekly pill sorter he'd bought me as a gift, insisting it would help me keep everything straight. I also did something Ruth suggested that I initially resisted out of pure stubbornness. I quietly stopped eating anything he brought me and started buying my own groceries again, telling Denise I'd gotten back into cooking a bit since it gave me something to do in the evenings. Within 9 days of quietly refusing his food, the fog I had genuinely been living in for months, the mid-afternoon dizziness, the strange gaps where I'd walk into a room and forget why, the persistent low headache I had blamed on grief and age and the changing seasons, began, unmistakably, to lift. My hand stopped feeling faintly unsteady in the mornings. I read an entire newspaper front to back for the first time in what felt like a year without losing my place. On the 11th day, I drove myself to the hardware store for the first time since spring without white-knuckling the wheel the entire way, and I sat in the parking lot afterward and cried, because some part of me had quietly started believing I really was declining, that my mind really was slipping, that the man telling me so with such gentle, patient concern must be right. He had made me doubt my own mind. I do not think there is a crueler thing one person can do to another. I did not confront him. Ruth had made me promise, and I understood by then exactly why. If Victor realized I knew, the guardianship petition would either get rushed into a courtroom before I had real evidence to fight it, or he would simply change methods entirely and I would lose whatever fragile advantage my ignorance was currently giving me. So I kept eating my own cooking, kept smiling at Sunday dinners, kept thanking him for casseroles I quietly threw away in a neighbor's outdoor trash can 2 streets over, and I kept a small green notebook that I locked, each night, in the glove compartment of my truck. Ruth called me on a Thursday evening, 18 days after our first conversation, and told me for words that made my stomach drop the way it used to drop standing on scaffolding that had just shifted under my boots. Preston Holloway isn't real.
What do you mean he isn't real?
I mean there is no licensed physician named Preston Holloway registered with the State Medical Board, Ruth said. There's a man using that name who rents a suite 2 floors below Victor's own office, sees a small handful of patients referred exclusively by Victor Coulter, and bills them directly in cash for concierge memberships. No malpractice insurance on file. No hospital privileges anywhere in the state. Edwin, whoever this man is, he is not a doctor. He is a prop. I sat down hard on my own porch steps. There's more, Ruth continued, and her voice had the particular flatness she used to get, I remembered now, right before delivering the worst part of any case. I pulled property and court records in 3 neighboring counties going back 8 years. Victor Coulter has been listed, under slightly varied business names, as a financial consultant connected to no fewer than 3 prior guardianship or conservatorship petitions involving elderly clients. 2 of those petitions were granted before anyone objected. In both of those cases, the elderly person's primary residence was sold within 14 months of the guardianship being approved. Edwin, I don't think you're the first person he's done this to. I think you might just be the first one who noticed in time. Ruth drove out herself, 2 days later, to visit one of the earlier cases in person, an 81-year-old widower named Harlan Pruitt, 2 counties north, whose modest lakefront cottage had been sold 11 months after a guardianship order was granted in Victor's favor 5 years earlier. She came back that evening and sat across from me at my kitchen table with a folder thick enough that it made a solid sound when she set it down. Harlan doesn't remember much clearly anymore, she told me, and I could hear something in her voice that she was working hard to keep level. He's in a state-run care facility now, on a fixed income that wouldn't cover a month's rent on the cottage he used to own outright. He remembers a nice young man who managed his money for a while. He remembers feeling foggy and confused for most of a year, the way you did. He doesn't remember signing away guardianship of himself, because by the time it happened, he says, he genuinely wasn't sure anymore what was real and what wasn't. Edwin, that's the part that should scare you most. It isn't only that Victor takes the money and the property. It's that by the time he's done, some of these people can no longer even be certain of their own memory well enough to fight back. I sat with that for a long moment before I could speak. How is that legal for so long? How does nobody catch this? Because most of his targets are exactly like Harlan, Ruth said quietly. Widowed, isolated, without a Grace Patron at the mailbox or a Milo repeating something through a heating vent. You had people around you who loved you enough to notice something was wrong, Edwin. Most of his other victims didn't. I want to stop here and tell you plainly what that felt like, because I think some of you have felt something close to it. It is one thing to suspect a person you love has hurt you. It is another thing entirely to learn that the hurt was never personal at all, that you were simply the next building on a list, assessed for what could be extracted from your walls before anyone thought to check the foundation. What do we do? I asked her, and I noticed my voice had gone very quiet. Now, Ruth said, we build a case strong enough that no judge in this state grants that petition, and strong enough that a prosecutor takes an interest in everything that came before it. I want to bring in an attorney. There's a man I've worked with for 15 years named Samuel Okafor. Elder law and fraud litigation both. He's the best I know for exactly this situation. And Edwin, I think it's time we also talked about getting eyes and ears inside your own house, because right now everything we have is circumstantial. We need him saying it himself. If you've made it this far with me, I want to thank you, and I want to ask you something honestly, not just as a comment-bait question but because I genuinely wonder about it. if you suspected someone in your own family was quietly building a case to take control of your life, would you confront them the moment you knew, or would you do what I did, and wait, and watch, and gather the proof first? I think about that choice more than almost anything else from this whole ordeal. Let me know in the comments, because I still don't know, some nights, if I made the right one. And again, a gentle note, the surveillance and legal details ahead have been adapted somewhat for this telling, though everything is grounded in how these cases genuinely unfold. Samuel Okafor's office was on the second floor of a converted mill building downtown, all exposed brick and tall windows, and he greeted me with a handshake that reminded me, oddly, of the way I used to shake hands with young engineers on their first big job, respectful, but already assessing whether the person in front of him could handle what was coming. "Ruth's told me the broad strokes," he said, once we were seated. "I want you to walk me through every piece of it yourself, in your own words, and I want you to tell me if anything I'm about to explain doesn't make sense, because none of this will help you if you don't fully understand your own case." I told him everything. He took notes in a small, precise hand, and when I finished, he set his pen down and folded his hands. "Edwin, here's where we stand, legally," he said. "A guardianship petition claiming incapacity, supported by an affidavit from a man impersonating a physician, is not just insufficient. If we can prove Holloway isn't licensed, it becomes fraud on the court, which is a serious matter for anyone who submitted it knowingly. Separately, if what you're describing about your symptoms lifting once you stopped eating food Victor prepared turns out to be substantiated by testing, we may be looking at administering a substance to cause impairment, which in this state is a felony assault charge, not a civil matter at all. And if Ruth's research holds up regarding prior guardianships followed by property sales, we may be looking at a pattern significant enough to interest the county prosecutor's financial crimes unit, not just a family court judge. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "3 things, Okafor said. First, I'm filing preemptively with the probate court today, a formal notice that you can test any future guardianship petition and are requesting an independent capacity evaluation from a court-appointed physician of the court's choosing, not Victor's. That alone should freeze anything he tries to file. Second, I want a real medical toxicology screening done immediately, through an independent lab, not anyone connected to your regular doctor's office, given what we now know about Holloway. Third, and Ruth agrees with me on this, I think it's time to document what's actually being said in your house when you're not in the room." I thought about my grandson's voice in that diner booth. "Why does Dad say you're not real family?" I thought about how much of this entire nightmare had reached me only because a 7-year-old repeated something through a heating vent that he didn't fully understand the weight of. "Do it," I said. "Whatever you need." The toxicology results came back 9 days later. I sat across from a physician named Dr. Farah Witten at an independent diagnostic lab 2 counties over, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair, who slid a printed report across her desk and tapped one highlighted line with her pen. "Zolpidem and a low-dose benzodiazepine, both present in your system at levels inconsistent with any prescription currently on your chart," she said. "Neither compound is something you've been prescribed. At the doses suggested by these levels, taken repeatedly over weeks, you would expect exactly the symptoms you described to me: daytime confusion, unsteady gait, short-term memory gaps, a kind of persistent fog that most people, and frankly most physicians not specifically looking for it, would mistake for early cognitive decline in a man your age." "Someone's been drugging me," I said, out loud, for the first time, and hearing the words in my own voice made them undeniably real in a way that suspicion never had. "Someone has," Dr. Witten said, not unkindly. "And Mr. Marsh, I want to say this clearly because I've seen it matter in exactly these kinds of cases. This report, generated by an independent, accredited lab with a documented chain of custody, is admissible as legal evidence. Whoever did this was betting that nobody would think to test for it, because everyone around you had already been told you were simply declining. That is often, unfortunately, exactly the point. I drove home from that appointment with the report folded in my jacket pocket, and for the first time since Milo's question in that diner booth, I felt something other than fear. I felt the particular, cold clarity I used to feel standing in a condemned building once I finally understood exactly which beam had failed and why. It is a terrible feeling. It is also, in its own way, a relief, because once you know exactly what's broken, you can finally start deciding how to fix it. Ruth's technician, a quiet, careful man named Desmond who'd done surveillance installation for her firm for a decade, came to the house 2 days later and installed 5 small cameras before lunch, one in the smoke detector above the living room, one inside a decorative clock on the kitchen wall, one tucked into a bookshelf in my study facing my desk, one in a picture frame in the front hallway, and one in the guest bathroom's exhaust fan housing, angled only at the hallway outside the door. Because Desmond was careful, he told me never to record inside a bathroom itself. Everything synced to an encrypted cloud account accessible only from my laptop and Ruth's office server. For the next 3 weeks, I watched my own house the way I used to watch a building under stress, waiting to see exactly where the crack would finally show itself all the way through. There is a particular strain that comes from living inside your own house as both the resident and the surveillance subject, and I want to describe it honestly, because I think it's a part of this kind of ordeal that people rarely talk about. I found myself, some mornings, performing normalcy even when I was completely alone, simply out of habit, smiling at nothing while I made coffee, saying good morning out loud to an empty kitchen, as if some part of me had started to believe the cameras themselves were the only audience I had left that mattered. I mentioned this to Ruth once, half joking, and she didn't laugh at all. That's not uncommon, she told me. People under this kind of pressure sometimes forget which version of themselves is the real one and which is the performance. Just remember, Edwin, the version of you writing things down in that notebook at midnight, refusing to eat what you're handed, asking hard questions quietly instead of loudly, that's the real one. The smiling at the dinner table is the performance, and it's a temporary one. Most of what the cameras captured was almost unbearably ordinary. Victor helping me carry in groceries. Denise and Milo visiting on a Sunday, Milo building an elaborate blanket fort in the living room while I read to him from a dinosaur encyclopedia he loved. Victor doing dishes, humming to himself, looking for all the world like an attentive son-in-law in a happy, ordinary family. I want to be honest with you, there were evenings I sat watching that footage and felt something close to grief, because some small stubborn part of me kept hoping I would see nothing at all. That I would find out I had been wrong, that Ruth had been wrong, that the guardianship form had some innocent explanation I simply hadn't thought of yet. I found the truth on a Tuesday evening, at 9:47 p.m., in the footage from the study bookshelf camera. Victor sat at my desk, which he had no particular reason to be sitting at, with his laptop open and his phone pressed to his ear, speaking in the low, clipped tone of a man who believed he was alone in the house. I had gone, according to the cover story he and Denise believed, to bed early with a headache. In reality, I was in my own kitchen with the volume on my laptop turned down low, watching. "He's still testing okay on the basic stuff," Victor said into the phone. That's the problem. Holloway's notes say mild impairment, but mild isn't enough for an emergency order. I need something the judge can't argue with. What if we just bump the dosage for the next 2 weeks before the evaluation? A pause. Then, quieter, I know it's risky. I know. But Denise is starting to ask questions about why her father seems foggier some weeks than others, and I can't have her digging into this before the petition's filed. Once I've got guardianship, I control the house, I control the late property, and I control the trust, including the education fund the wife set up for the kid, which by the way is worth a hell of a lot more than anyone bothered telling me before the wedding. My hands, watching that footage 2 nights later on the encrypted playback Ruth's office had prepared for me, were absolutely steady. I want you to understand that by that point, the shaking had already happened, weeks earlier, alone in my truck. What was left, once I finally heard him say it plainly, was something colder and much more useful. The call continued. The other voice, tinny through the phone speaker but audible, belonged, we would later confirm, to the man calling himself Preston Halloway. The dosage increase carries real risk at his age, the voice said. Cardiac stress, full risk. If something happens to him before the paperwork's filed, there's no guardianship to inherit, Victor. There's just a dead father-in-law and a very curious medical examiner. Then we move the filing date up, Victor said. End of the month instead of next quarter. I'll handle Denise. I've already got her half convinced her father's had a rough year since her mother died, more than she wants to admit. And the kid doesn't matter. Kids forget things by Christmas. I sat in my kitchen at midnight and listened to my son-in-law describe my own grandson, the boy who slept some nights in a blanket fort built specifically so he could feel close to me, as an inconvenience who would simply forget. If you're still here with me, I want you to comment the word "still here," because I genuinely need to know that somewhere out there, someone is sitting with me in this moment the way I sat alone in that kitchen. And I need to say clearly, again, that certain phrases and exact dialogue in this retelling have been reconstructed from memory and from recordings later reviewed by attorneys, and some details have been altered, but the substance, the intent behind those words, is exactly what was found. I called Ruth at 12:14 that morning. She picked up on the second ring, the way people do when they've spent 30 years training themselves to answer at any hour. I have it, I said. All of it. The dosage, the trust, the filing date, all of it, on tape. There was a pause on her end, and then, in a voice I had never quite heard from her before, something close to fury held very carefully in check. Send it to Okafor and to me right now, both. Edwin, I need you to listen to me. This just became something bigger than a family court matter. What you just described, deliberately increasing a controlled substance dosage with knowledge of cardiac risk in order to influence a legal proceeding, that's not just fraud anymore. Depending on how a prosecutor wants to frame intent, that edges toward attempted harm. We are calling the county sheriff's financial crimes unit in the morning, and I think, given what we now know about prior cases in other counties, we should also loop in the state attorney general's elder abuse task force. What about Denise? I said. What about Milo? That, Ruth said quietly, is the part we have to handle carefully. Your daughter is not a suspect. From everything on that recording, she's being managed exactly like you were, kept confused, kept slightly off balance, kept just uncertain enough about her own father's condition that she won't ask the hard questions at the hard moment. We need to bring her the truth in a way that protects her and protects Milo, not in a way that makes her feel ambushed alongside her husband. The following morning, I did something that cost me more than almost anything else in this entire ordeal. I called my daughter and asked her to meet me alone, without Victor, at a coffee shop across town, telling her only that I needed to talk to her about something important regarding my health. Denise arrived looking tired and worried in a way that broke something in my chest, because I understood, sitting across from her, that some of that tiredness had been manufactured for her, the same way mine had. I told her everything as gently and as plainly as I could. The guardianship petition. Dr. Halloway's fake credentials. The toxicology report. The recording from the previous night. I watched my daughter's face go through disbelief, then confusion, then something that looked almost physically painful to witness, the moment a person realizes the ground they've been standing on for 4 years was never solid at all. He told me you were declining, she whispered. He told me gently, over months, that you were struggling, that I should be prepared, that it broke his heart to see it happening to you. I believed him because I didn't want it to be true, and because it was easier to believe your health was failing than to believe my husband was." She stopped. She could not finish the sentence. "You are not responsible for believing someone who lied to you carefully and for a long time," I told her, and I meant it completely, because I had needed, badly, to hear the exact same thing from Ruth a few weeks earlier. Denise agreed, that same afternoon, to speak with the county detective Ruth had already contacted, a measured, thorough woman named Detective Priya Sundaram, who specialized in financial exploitation cases involving elderly victims. Denise also agreed, though it clearly cost her something enormous, to help set up the final piece of the case, a recorded conversation with Victor that afternoon, wired discreetly by Detective Sundaram's technician, in which Denise, coached carefully beforehand on exactly what to ask and exactly what not to reveal, asked her husband directly about the guardianship paperwork she claimed to have accidentally seen in his bag. I was not in the house for that conversation. I sat in Ruth's office 2 towns over with Okafor and Detective Sundaram, listening on a live feed, my hands wrapped around a coffee cup I never drank, while my daughter walked into her own kitchen and asked her husband to explain himself. Victor's voice, when it finally admitted the truth, did not sound like a man confessing. It sounded, chillingly, like a man closing a business deal. "It was never about hurting your father, Denise," he said. "It's about being smart. He's sitting on a house worth close to $400,000, a lake property worth another $300,000, and a trust fund for Milo that nobody thought to mention was worth 6 figures before I married into this family. Guardianship isn't cruelty. It's just structure. Someone needs to manage all of that properly before he does something foolish with it in his old age, and frankly, it might as well be us." "You drugged him," Denise said, her voice shaking in a way that, I learned afterward, was not entirely acting. "You made him think he was losing his mind." "I made sure the paperwork would hold up," Victor said. "There's a difference." "There isn't," Denise said. "There really isn't, Victor." Detective Sundaram signaled the arrest team the following morning. They did not go in loudly. There was no dramatic door-kicking scene, no flashing lights outside a family home with a 7-year-old inside. Detective Sundaram, to her enormous credit, arranged for Victor to be taken into custody at his own office, quietly, before business hours, while Milo was already at school and Denise, with Milo's overnight bag already packed the night before, was staying temporarily at my house. I was standing in my own kitchen at 8:20 that morning when Ruth called to tell me it was done. "He's in custody," she said. Sundaram's team also executed a search warrant on the office 2 floors below his, the one Dr. Holloway was using. They found identical guardianship paperwork templates for at least 4 other elderly clients across 3 counties, 2 of whom, Edwin, are still alive and still under a version of the arrangement you almost fell into. Sundaram's already reached out to Adult Protective Services in both those counties this morning. I sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where I had once written down small suspicious details on a legal pad at midnight, and I put my head in my hands, and for the first time since that afternoon in the diner, I let myself cry. 6 months passed between Victor Coulter's arrest and his trial, and I will not walk you through every deposition and every filing, because frankly there were months where the paperwork alone could fill a book longer than the story I'm telling you tonight. I will tell you the parts that mattered. Dr. Preston Holloway turned out to be a man named Gerald Trumbo, a former medical billing administrator who had lost his own license to practice in any capacity years earlier after a separate fraud conviction in another state, and who had been working with Victor, we learned through Trumbo's own plea agreement, for nearly 6 years across at least for documented cases of attempted or completed guardianship fraud targeting elderly homeowners. Trumbo, facing his own decades of potential prison time, agreed to testify fully against Victor in exchange for a reduced sentence. The county prosecutor's office, working alongside the state attorney general's Elder Abuse Task Force, ultimately charged Victor Coulter with fraud upon the court, forgery of a medical document, and administering a substance with intent to cause impairment, a felony in our state given the deliberate and repeated nature of the dosing described in both my toxicology reports and the recorded conversations. Gerald Trumbo was separately charged with practicing medicine without a license and conspiracy. The trial itself lasted 11 days. I testified for the better part of one full afternoon, walking the jury through the diner booth conversation with Milo, the folder I'd photographed in the front hallway, the toxicology results, and finally the recording, played in full for the courtroom, of Victor's own voice describing my grandson as something that would simply be forgotten by Christmas. I watched 2 members of the jury visibly react to that line. I am not ashamed to tell you I nearly could not finish reading it aloud myself. Denise testified the following day. It was, I think, the hardest thing I have ever watched my daughter do. She described, plainly and without flinching, the slow months of being told her father was declining, the gentle, patient way Victor had built that story in her mind so carefully that she'd started, without realizing it, watching me for signs of confusion that had never actually been there. When the defense attorney suggested, gently, that perhaps Denise herself had simply been an inattentive daughter who should have noticed her father's symptoms sooner, I watched her sit up straighter in that witness chair and answer, in a voice that did not shake at all, I noticed exactly what my husband wanted me to notice, because that was his entire plan. That's what makes this so hard to forgive. Ruth testified about the pattern uncovered across 3 counties, and it was during her testimony that the courtroom heard, for the first time in open court, the name Harlan Pruitt read into the record alongside a photograph of the modest lakefront cottage he no longer owned. Detective Sundaram testified about the search of Trumbo's office and the additional victims identified, 2 of whom, she confirmed under oath, had since been connected with adult protective services in their own counties as a direct result of this case. Dr. Witten testified about the toxicology findings, walking the jury patiently through exactly how a slow, deliberate dosage could mimic the appearance of natural cognitive decline in a man my age, and why very few physicians would think to test for it unless someone specifically suspected foul play. Victor's defense attorney, a composed, silver-tongued man named Preston Kessler, a coincidence of names that Ruth pointed out to me with a dark, tired little laugh in the hallway outside the courtroom, attempted, during his cross-examination of Denise, to suggest that she herself might have exaggerated her father's symptoms out of guilt over not visiting more often after her mother's death. I watched my daughter's spine straighten in that chair, and I watched her answer without a single tremor in her voice. When Kessler turned to me and suggested, gently, that a man of my age and profession, accustomed to being the authority in every room, might simply have resented ceding financial control to a younger man and constructed this entire narrative out of wounded pride, I told him, as calmly as I have ever said anything in my life, that I had spent 41 years being paid specifically to notice when something was structurally unsound beneath a surface that looked fine to everyone else, and that nothing about my son-in-law's behavior over the previous year had looked fine to me for a single day once I finally started looking closely. The jury foreman, a woman in her 40s with reading glasses pushed up into her hair much like Dr. Witten's, was writing something down when I said it, and I have wondered ever since whether that was the exact moment the verdict became certain in her mind. And on the final day, after 4 hours of jury deliberation, Victor Coulter was found guilty on all counts. At sentencing, the judge, a stern, silver-haired woman named Judge Marisol Reyna, addressed Victor directly before announcing his sentence. "Mr. Coulter," she said, "you did not simply attempt to defraud a vulnerable man of his property. You systematically poisoned the trust between a father and his daughter, and between a grandfather and his grandchild, as a tool to protect your scheme. This court has seen elder financial abuse before. It has rarely seen it executed with this degree of calculated cruelty toward a small child who had done nothing but overhear a truth he was too young to fully understand." Victor Coulter was sentenced to 14 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after 9, along with a restitution order covering the full cost of the toxicology testing, legal fees, and a civil penalty payable directly to me and to the education trust established for Milo. Gerald Trumbo, under his plea agreement, received 6 years. I want to tell you now about the part of this story that matters far more to me than any courtroom, because I suspect it's the part some of you have been waiting to hear about since the very first sentence of this video. Denise filed for divorce the week after the arrest, and it was finalized 9 months later. She and Milo moved back into a small rental 2 streets from my house, close enough that Milo now rides his bicycle over most Saturday mornings without anyone needing to drive him. It took a long time, and a good deal of careful, patient conversation guided by a family therapist named Dr. Renata Osei, before Milo fully understood what had actually happened, in language gentle and honest enough for a 7-year-old, and then an 8-year-old, to hold without being frightened by it. I remember the exact evening, for months after the trial ended, when Milo finally asked me the second question that mattered as much to me as the first one had. We were sitting on my back porch, the same porch Rosalind used to sit on with her evening tea, watching the fireflies come up out of the tall grass at the edge of the yard, and Milo, swinging his legs off the edge of the step, asked, without looking at me, "Grandpa, was I real family the whole time? Even when Dad said I wasn't supposed to say you were." I put my arm around him and told him the truest thing I know. Milo, real family isn't something anyone else gets to decide for you. It's not paperwork, and it's not what somebody tells you through a wall. Real family is who shows up, who tells you the truth even when it's hard, and who never, ever asks you to pretend you didn't hear something you heard. You were never anything less than real family. Not for one single second. He leaned against my shoulder and didn't say anything else for a long time, and neither did I, and the fireflies kept coming up out of the grass the way they always had, the way I hoped they always would. I want to close tonight the way I try to close every story I tell you, with the things I actually learned, stripped down to what might genuinely help someone listening who is living through the beginning of something similar right now. First, if a child in your family repeats something strange they overheard, do not dismiss it as childish confusion. Children very often report the truth more accurately than the adults around them, precisely because they haven't yet learned to explain it away. Second, if your own mind or body starts behaving in ways that don't match how you actually feel, persistent fog, dizziness, memory lapses that seem to come and go depending on who's been in the house, do not simply accept the first comforting explanation offered to you, especially if that explanation is being offered by someone who benefits from you believing it. Third, document everything, quietly and without confrontation, before you ever raise your suspicions out loud. Evidence gathered after a confrontation is evidence that's already been given time to disappear. Fourth, find one person you trust completely and tell them everything, even the parts that feel paranoid or embarrassing to say out loud. I found my Ruth. I hope, if you ever need one, you find yours. And fifth, the one I think about the most, standing on that porch with my grandson leaning against my shoulder, the people who try to isolate you from the ones who love you are almost always doing it because those relationships are the very thing that would expose them. If someone is working quietly to convince a child that you are not real family, ask yourself honestly what it would cost that person if the child kept talking to you freely. The answer is usually the whole truth of what they're trying to hide. There was a period, right after the arrest, when Denise could barely look at me without apologizing, over and over, for things that were never hers to apologize for. She would sit at my kitchen table some evenings, Milo asleep in his old room down the hall, and tell me she should have seen it, should have asked harder questions, should have trusted her instincts about the strange hours and the sudden casseroles and the way her husband always seemed to have an answer ready before she'd even fully asked the question. I told her, as many times as it took, that a person who is being deliberately and skillfully deceived is not the same as a person who is careless, and that I of all people understood exactly how convincing a lie can be when someone has spent months building it one gentle, reasonable-sounding brick at a time. Dr. Renata Osei, the family therapist who worked with Denise and Milo for the better part of a year, told me once, in a session I sat in on at Denise's request, that trauma like this doesn't resolve so much as it gets renegotiated, over and over, in small ordinary moments, a shared dinner that goes fine, a birthday that isn't overshadowed by fear, a night where nobody wakes up checking that the doors are locked twice. I have found that to be true. Healing in our house did not arrive as a single dramatic turning point. It arrived, slowly, as Tuesday night dinners that stopped feeling like performances and started feeling like Tuesday night dinners again. Grace Patrone still stops me at the mailbox most weeks, though these days it's usually to hand over a jar of the strawberry preserve she makes every June, and to ask, with real warmth in her voice, how Milo's doing in school. I told her once, months after the trial ended, that if she hadn't said something about that cooler bag at 1 a.m, I'm not certain how much longer it would have taken me to start asking the right questions, and she waved me off the way people do when they don't want to be thanked for simply doing the decent thing. I think decency like that deserves to be named out loud anyway, so I'm naming it here.